Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Prescott. I'm a primatologist by training. I now work at the UK's National Centre for the 3Rs, a scientific organisation established by the UK government to fund alternatives to animal research and to work with scientists to implement the 3Rs. And for the past 10 years, I've been leading the Centre's programme on improving the welfare of primates used in research. So this presentation is going to be about social housing of non-human primates and how you can facilitate that. And it's really born out of 10 years of reviewing research proposals involving the use of primates and encouraging and facilitating others to provide social housing for their primates. It's going to be a practical and visual presentation. I'm not going to be presenting very many data or citing the literature heavily, but nonetheless I think you'll find it a very interesting and useful presentation. So this is the overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk first of all about the benefits of social housing and then refer to some of the legal texts which encourage social housing, and then make some comments about things that can facilitate social housing, like a large space, a complex space, socialization of the animals, and choosing compatible animals in establishing social groups, and then the importance of a flexible enclosure design to enable scientific procedures to be performed and husbandry procedures to be performed with group housed animals. And then finally I'll touch on how we can challenge some of the perceived scientific requirements for single housing, and then to summarize at the end. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and I'll answer those at the end. So the benefits of social housing. Well, I think everybody working with primates recognizes that these are gregarious social animals, and group housing is really fundamental for their welfare because it enables social behaviors like grooming and social play, which can benefit the psychological well-being of the animals. It reduces behavioural abnormalities. We have quite a large data set supporting that. It can buffer the effect of stressful situations such as veterinary or research procedures, and it usually means that animals are housed in a larger space and each animal has use of that larger space, which can mean that they are more able to perform natural behaviours, which again will benefit their welfare. It can also make more efficient use of the space within a room. And it can mean that because the animals behave more normally, we have more normative species data which can be of greater scientific value. So there are many benefits of social housing of non-human primates. And accordingly, social housing is recommended as the default standard housing configuration for primates used in research in many legal texts and professional guidelines, and I've just put a few of them on this slide. And all of the texts generally recommend that primates are housed socially unless there are veterinary or scientific or welfare reasons why you might house them singly. So just looking at the European texts, you can read it for yourself. I've put up the new European Directive and the appendix to Convention ETS 123, and they say that the only exceptions to social housing should be either for veterinary reasons or where an experimental protocol demands it to ensure good science. And similarly, within the USA, for example, the Animal Welfare Act encourages or requires that people address the social needs of primates, and again recommends that the ILA guide recommends that animals should be housed socially in pairs or groups, except where single housing is required for experimental reasons or because of social incompatibility. But it's quite clear that the interpretation of what constitutes a scientific reason for single housing or a veterinary reason can differ between establishments right around the world. And this is evident from the review of research proposals that I do that are submitted to the major research funding bodies like the Medical Research Council or the Wellcome Trust in the UK, where a team of scientists is proposing primate research which may be conducted anywhere in the world. And within their proposals, they may suggest that they will socially house the animals or they will singly house the animals. Over the 10 years that NC3Rs has been reviewing these research proposals, and our role is really to look at the animal welfare implications and the opportunities for implementing the 3Rs, and we do this whilst the scientific review is ongoing using international peer reviewers from around the world. We've reviewed about 450 proposals since we first began this review in 2004. I'm just having a little bit of trouble with my slides here. Please bear with me. I think what I'll do is I'll carry on with the voice while I wait for the computer to catch up with me. So one factor that probably contributes to the ability to more easily socially house animals within the EU, I think, is the space allocations which are required under the directive and convention. Within the EU, for macaques, for example, there is a minimum enclosure size. The cages must be 1.8 meters high, and there must be 2 meters squared of floor space for 2 macaques over 3 years old. This means that no double tiers are allowed, and it means that the animals can get up high in a position probably on eye level with their human caregivers. And the fact that you can house 1 to 2 macaques in this, what is effectively 3.6 meters cubed space, means that the legislation is encouraging pair housing or group housing of animals. Now, elsewhere, the space allocations are not as generous. So, for example, under the ILA guide, a macaque of 3 to 10 kilograms must have at least 0.76 meters cage height and 0.4 meters floor space. So that means that the minimum cage dimensions, according to the ILA guide, are 6 times smaller than those in the EU. So certainly macaques in the EU are given generally more space. And this is illustrated on this slide. Now, the advantage of more space, of course, means that you can make that space more complex. It's more easy to enrich that space. So the types of enclosures that it's common to see in European contract research organisations or universities are shown on this next slide. The slides are taking quite a while to load. Apologies for that. So gang housing, as it's often called, is very much the norm within EU research establishments. And typically, what you see these days is cages which are effectively built into the room space rather than freestanding commercially available stainless steel caging. And this type of caging is really nice. It can be very easily enriched. Many of the enclosure designs are very flexible so that you can close down the space to house smaller groups or expand it to house larger groups. And we found that the animals are less aggressive in this type of enclosure. They're calmer, they're more easily handled. There are more opportunities for them to retreat from animals that they're perhaps not getting on with. They can manage their social interactions more easily. So there are lots of benefits for welfare. This type of caging has been approved by client companies of contract research organisations, and regulatory studies have been performed in this type of housing, and none of the data have been rejected by the regulators. So here you can see a stainless steel play area on the right, which is adjoined to a bank of stainless steel caging in a university, again giving the animals space that can be enriched. And here's a very nice setup at a UK CRO where you can see group housed animals with the verandas, with space that can be divided, with visual barriers so the animals can get away from each other. And the animal at the bottom there coming up through the pothole, that is actually an upper level to the enclosure that you can see on the left. So that's enclosures that run over 2 floors, and again this means that animals can get away from each other and manage their social interactions better. Now, this type of housing, social housing in EU compliant cages that are well enriched, is a requirement under the NC3R's primate guidelines, which we developed in 2006 and which are adopted by the major funding bodies that you can see on the bottom there. So if anybody receives funding for primate research from any of these major funding bodies, then they must provide social housing and EU-size caging and environmental enrichment wherever that research is conducted in the world. And this has really led to changes in practice in many facilities funded through the UK funders. So to just give you an example, working with the facility, NC3Rs was able to encourage and insist, in fact, that 40 owl monkeys, which were used in a malaria study in South America, were pair housed in cages 3.6 meters cubed instead of singly housed in cages 10 times smaller. So this is a very powerful driver for changes in practice. But how have the facilities been able to adapt what they normally do in order to meet the requirements? Well, they've done this in a number of ways. If we look at first of all, the cage space, in situations where people have conventional stainless steel type caging, what they've been able to do is to remove the dividers between adjoining cages in order to give the animals a larger amount of space. So within the US, for example, we would require that 6 of these cage units are joined together, and you can house 2 macaques within that space. So customizing the existing caging is one way in which you can meet the space requirements, and that has been done in a number of facilities. An alternative is to build an additional enclosure. We often call them play areas. These can be built quite cheaply from wood and mesh, and that is adjoined to the conventional bank of caging, and you give the animals the run of the whole space unless you need to confine them for a veterinary or scientific purpose. And you can enrich that wood and mesh play area with swings, ladders, perches, etc. To really give the animals the opportunity to perform more natural behaviours which benefits their welfare. And again, this has been done on funded research projects and can be done relatively cheaply. I have already mentioned the importance of a complex environment for the animals managing their social interactions. On the left, you can see it's actually a breeding environment for rhesus macaques, and on the right, we have the cynomolgus macaques. And again, you can see the complex space, the pop holes, the visual barriers, which enable the animals to get away from each other and manage their social interactions. And it's really felt anecdotally that this is much more successful housing arrangement for social housing. So moving away from cage space and cage complexity, it's important to think about where the animals are sourced from, how you create your groups of animals, and how you monitor them in the long term so that you have stable groups which really last. A colleague of mine at the NC3R's, Catherine Chapman, conducted a survey recently which was published in 2013 looking at the success of social housing of macaques used in toxicology studies. And you can see from that first line there that EU and non-EU sites are very successful at socially housing adult female macaques and juvenile macaques. But there is a difference in the success of social housing of adult males between those two regions. Things that can potentially account for this are whether pairs are established prior to dosing and whether the pairs are established utilizing information which is provided by the supplier about the compatibility of the animals and their social history. In the EU sites, the animals typically originate from one group, so compatibility is already partially established, and using behavioural analysis tools, you can identify animals from within that larger group with which to form your groups that then go on to study. And this is something that some CROs have a lot of experience in, and indeed some of the animals will be supplied with an individual history file which gives information about the relationships between the animals, who they've been grouped with previously, and this means that study directors can actually use these socialization data to assign animals to groups, either sometimes taking into account the weight of the animals and sometimes basing the groups solely on the socialization data. These data can be gathered by observing the animals and looking at their behaviour towards each other. This can be done at the breeding centre. It can also be done within the establishment when the animals arrive. What many people do is to look for dominance behaviours and subordinance behaviours performed between individual animals, and by counting these you can establish the hierarchy within the group and then select animals for pairs or groups that show clear dominant subordinate relationships, and in that way be confident that you have animals that are likely to maintain that hierarchy and get on with each other. And actually there's quite a literature published in this area about pair formation, certainly for adult male and female macaques, and these data are being used in practice to create stable groups. So you can look at aggressive behaviours like threatening, grimacing, yawning and charging, and subordinate behaviours like lip smacking or rump presentation, and ensure that you are establishing compatible groups from the start, and then the idea is to maintain those compatible groups throughout the life and use of the animal. And it is possible to house animals socially even during quarantine. I know that some facilities which are set up to handle very large batches of animals will house them singly, but some quarantine facilities are moving away from that traditional practice. One issue is the time that is required to establish compatible pairs or groups, but if that's done at the source, then I wouldn't accept the time as a reason why you should singly house animals. in quarantine, there is concern that if there should be disease, either individual clinical or subclinical disease, then this could spread within the room. And this is sometimes proposed as a reason for singly housing the animals during quarantine. But to be honest, I think common practice is to treat the entire room, or at least the nearest neighbours, if you do have animals with clinical or subclinical disease. So if you would do that anyway, then it's not really an argument for single housing. So we have successfully challenged the requirement for single housing in quarantine. We've also challenged the requirement for single housing in neuroscience studies using macaques. There is a move, I think, towards housing animals with cranial implants together. It may not be possible at all times, but it is certainly the standard within UK neuroscience facilities that animals with cranial implants are housed together. Some of the newer implant designs, which can be kept more easily clean and free of infection, do certainly facilitate this, but even animals with cranial implants made of dental acrylic are housed together. And people do sometimes say, oh well, you know, the animals can pick at the implants, but really this is the case whether the animals are in single housing or group housing. And we've found over the years that there has not been additional damage to the implant, and you can successfully house neuroscience animals in this way. Similarly, it's possible to house animals on toxicology studies in groups, and this is commonly done within the UK and the EU. So even telemetered animals or animals on infusion studies, which will be wearing jackets, can be housed socially. Key to this is designing a good jacket design that the animals are comfortable with, and that they don't try and get out of, and very long durations of social housing can be accommodated. Of course, the telemetry devices themselves, there are companies which produce devices which transmit on multiple frequencies, so you can have a number of telemetered animals within the group with a device transmitting on different frequencies, or indeed, where you don't have those devices, it's possible to house a telemetered animal with a naive companion which is not telemetered, and in that way provide companionship for those animals. Other procedures or other data that are collected for animals on toxicology studies include food and water consumption and clinical signs. Now, it is difficult to measure individual food and water consumption in group housed animals, but it is possible to really question whether you need those individual food and water consumption data, and whether instead you can observe the eating and drinking behaviour of the animals and monitor their body weight, and that may well be sufficient to identify treatment effects that might reduce appetite. Similarly, some people say it's more difficult to record clinical signs such as vomiting in animals that are group housed. That depends on the monitoring systems that you have in place for the animals. But I think it has to be recognised that actually animals in a socially housed environment display more natural behaviour, and it may be possible to identify disturbances to that behaviour more easily for animals that are housed in groups rather than singly housed animals which may be relatively inactive and quite depressed within the cage. So it's more feasible to identify changes in locomotion, balance, coordination, and certainly interaction with conspecifics in group housed animals. So actually the group housed environment can be more informative in terms of the effects of drugs upon the animals. Another procedure which may be performed on toxicology studies is of course urine collection. one should always question whether you need a total collection of urine or whether a spot sample would be sufficient, in which case you can train animals to cooperate for that. If you do need total collection, it may be that you can continue to house the animals socially, but just separate the individual or individuals from which you are collecting urine in a space within the cage. And this is where really flexible enclosure designs are really important. So here you can see an example from a German CRO where we have the cage on the right, and at the back of that cage is an area where the animal can be confined for short periods for procedures, in this case urine collection, and you can see the setup on the left which enables you to collect urine from that animal but keep it within a social environment. Similarly, these cage designs which allow you to confine animals temporarily but still allow auditory, visual, olfactory, and in some cases tactile access to their conspecifics, can be used, for example, to measure individual fluid intake for animals on fluid control, where they're working for fluid rewards, on neuroscience or behavioural studies. You may want to first of all establish how much fluid that animal would ordinarily take when it has free access to fluid, so you know what the baseline fluid intake is for that animal before you begin your fluid control regimen. And you can do that by temporarily dividing the animals within the enclosure so that they can't access each other's water, only their own water bottles. You can measure individual fluid consumption but still allow them social interactions. Even when animals start on the fluid control regimen, it's still possible to house them in groups. For example, you could have an animal on the fluid control regimen and a naive animal, and when the animal on the fluid control goes off to work within the laboratory, then you can give the other animal free access to fluid. It's important to monitor both of those animals to ensure that they're achieving sufficient fluid, of course. These areas where you can separate off the animals but keep them housed socially are also useful for post-operative recovery following surgery, where you want to allow the animal the space to recover, but you don't want to keep it out of the social group for a long time in case the hierarchy should change within that group, so that when you reintroduce the animal, you have a situation where the animals are fighting and the group breaks down. So generally it's thought that it's important to get the animals back into the social group as quickly as possible, and it may be that they can recover from surgery in a safe place but still within that social environment. Another reason that is sometimes given for single housing of animals is ease of capture. I don't think it's a very good reason. And the comment I wanted to make here is that establishments that we've worked with to move away from single housing to social housing can often agree to the social housing without really thinking through how they're going to cope with that social housing and perform their studies at the same time. So, for example, if you have large groups of animals and you need to capture individuals to perform sampling procedures or to dose those animals at given time points, you need to be able to reliably access that animal for that procedure, and that will involve training the animals to cooperate with capture so that you can reliably take your sample and obtain your data. This is facilitated by, again, areas where you can encourage the animals to come forward and sit within an area, stationed in a particular area, that you can then capture and restrain that animal and perform your procedure. So, for example, some CROs will train animals to come forward, to put their arm through the door of the cage. It's then possible to hold that arm to open the door of the cage, to restrain the animal as you would do normally and perform the procedure. Alternatively, you can train the animals to come to a place within the procedure, like the small boxes on the front of the cages on the left, and access the animal in that way. Moving on to other types of studies, it is possible to group house animals in infectious disease studies under containment. Here you can see a state-of-the-art containment system at a UK laboratory that has been designed and built for category 3 infectious agents, in this case TB studies, and the animals are successfully housed in groups of up to 6 for these studies. There is no reason arising from the barrier system itself while animals should not be housed in social groups, although the nature of the experiment, the barrier is designed to contain, may or may not allow social housing. But certainly in these studies the animals are socially housed. Of course, it's important that the animals in each group receive the same treatment, such as the infectious dose or the vaccination regime. It is not possible to house animals that receive live vaccines with naive animals, because there could be immune stimulation of the unvaccinated animals. So in that case, you wouldn't house them in groups, but provided they receive the same treatment, then it is possible to do that. I've talked a lot about macaques, and of course macaques will be macaques, and many of you who work and manage with them will know that they can be aggressive towards each other. There can be instances of fighting. These are data, published data from a single UK university, veterinary records for 90 research macaques used in neuroscience studies over a 10-year period. And what the data show, the graph on the right, is the number of impacts on the animal's welfare that do not arise from procedures. So it's what we might call contingent impacts on welfare. And you can see that the majority of the animals receive 1 to 5 of these contingent impacts on their welfare over their lifetime. And from the left-hand graph, the row at the bottom, you can see that the most frequent non-procedural impact on welfare is actually fight wounds not requiring surgery. So we know that these pairs or groups of macaques can eventually break down, and there can be fighting if the animals are re-establishing their hierarchy. And it may be necessary to separate those animals if they are continually fighting and causing damage that requires surgery. In that case, generally animals would be separated, but laboratories would always try to repair those animals with another companion and effectively recreate a new pair or new group. And if that should break down, they may try a second time. And the long-term aim, of course, is to get the animals back into pair or group housing. Occasionally, animals will be repeatedly group incompatible, in which case they may well be singly housed. But it's very important in those cases to look to ensure that you do all you can to ameliorate the negative effect of single housing, and many guidelines will recommend that where single housing is necessary, you give the animals visual, auditory and olfactory access to companions. They may even be able to interact socially with a limited period of tactile contact. Additional enrichment should be provided for the welfare of these animals, and if they enjoy human interaction, then positive human interaction can really contribute to the quality of life of these animals that are group incompatible and therefore singly housed. So in summary then, really the features that we feel have helped to facilitate social housing have been an increase in enclosure size, which enables you to then enrich that larger space, make it more complex in ways that can benefit the animal's ability to perform natural behaviours which will benefit their welfare. And certainly providing escape areas and visual barriers and multiple perches within the enclosure space at different heights, and multiple, for example, water bottles or enrichment devices so that there is less competition for those resources within the social group, can really help create a more successful, stable hierarchy and a social group that lasts in the long term. Flexible enclosures, which enable you to divide the space and temporarily separate the animals, are very important to facilitate the science while still allow social housing. Thinking about how you source and group animals and obtaining them in pre-existing social groups and avoiding breaking up those relationships can again facilitate long-term social housing. And identifying and monitoring compatible animals and observing their behaviour even when they're on study to ensure that if there are problems you can intervene early. Always challenge the perceived scientific or welfare need for single housing. I've given you some examples of arguments that have been put forward for single housing in the correspondence that I've had with applicants for research proposals. And working together, we've been able to really question whether there is a scientific need or a welfare need, and whether it is possible to socially house the animals. And indeed, in many cases it is. And I think what has given the facilities the confidence to move forward with social housing where they're previously singly housed is really the experience of those establishments that have overcome those perceived problems. And it's quite powerful for me, for example, to say, well, all of the research groups that I deal with have socially housed their animals with cranial implants for many, many years. And to put the new laboratory in touch with those people who have done that for many years so that they can learn about the tips and tricks that enable you to move forward with social housing. So my last point really is to seek advice from others about how they have met the same scientific and regulatory demands within a social housing context, and that can give you the information that you require to socially house your animals and give them those animal welfare benefits, and in some cases have the scientific benefits, and to meet the regulatory requirements without the need for single housing. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that you've submitted questions. I'm now going to take a look, and there aren't any. I've probably stunned you all into silence. It would be great if some of you were able to submit some questions or even some comments. You may find that much of what I've said you do it already, perhaps, or maybe you have some requests for some additional information about some of the examples I've given. I'd be happy to answer them if there are any.